Just gonna make sure that we're recording, and we are recording. So, um, sorry. Hi, my name is Sydney Stone. I'm here with Vince, Juliana, and Stephanie, and we are talking about our Bombingham discussion today, which we've been given prompt 6, which is discuss the nonviolent strategies of the civil rights movement, 2 examples of its leaders and examples of success and failure. How did their movement change following the legislative victories of 1964's Civil Rights Act and 1965's Voting Rights Act? So we're going to start by talking about the nonviolent strategies of the civil rights movement. This includes like peaceful protests, acts of civil disobedience, economic boycotts, stuff like that. So what do you guys want to talk about on this one?
I thought it was, oh, you can go first.
Well, I was researching I knew some of the major ones, but going back and actually going into depth into all the marches, all the protests, all the boycotts, it's it was astounding seeing how many people just went out, walked, marched, and how throughout the entire march they were just singing songs and just being peaceful throughout the whole events.
Yeah, they literally just went like, I'm doing this for the right reasons, and then the violence came from the other side, which I thought was horrific. But
Yeah, definitely. I also thought clearly boycotting and marching were like an excellent way of like being nonviolent and truly trying to get their message out. But something that really stuck to me was like the sit-ins, like what they would do, like the forms of protest that they would have to avoid, or not to avoid, but to oppose segregation. Like that to me, like rather than like protesting and marching is incredibly powerful, but simply sitting in just that moment of silence that you have with one another, it's clearly very silence, but it is so loud, like with what they're trying to say, like their message. Like for the video that we watched for humanities and one of the prior discussions for Elizabeth, the young girl who was just trying to get to school, she would stay completely quiet, but all of their violence and all of the shouting literally did not faze her one bit. And that to me was like super powerful. So just like, even though it wasn't a sit-in, just the silence and how powerful that truly is as well.
exactly, we also have to talk about like the strikes that they won on. They didn't ride on the buses, they didn't shop at certain stores, they got their gas from black-owned businesses, stuff like that, if they had cars, because there was such economic disparity. But I think it's also interesting when we look at the nonviolent strategies and how governing parties tried to outlaw nonviolent strategies. They said you cannot meet in public without a permit. They said you cannot meet in private if it's going to be talking about this stuff. And so they tried so hard to legalize the wrong side, the historically wrong side. So I thought that was interesting. And I thought how nonviolence was such a staple in the civil rights movement, and like the most prominent leaders like MLK, like they stood by it. They were fervent in their like they were very forthcoming as well in saying this is the right way to do it. This way we don't turn into martyrs, stuff like that. Vince, did you guys have something to add about this?
Actually, to add on to what you're saying, you're talking about how like they were legalizing the wrong side and how they were like stopping people from doing these nonviolent protests. I think MLK was actually wasn't he like prohibited from doing nonviolent operations in like Birmingham? And
Yeah.
isn't that like the reason why he was jailed? And you know that whole Birmingham letter from jail sort of thing. And I thought that was oh, sorry you guys. And I thought that was just really cool that even though they were like stopped from doing these things, they continued to fight on, and many were like arrested for it. And I think it goes to show the sacrifice sacrifices these people had to make by doing nonviolent strategies.
Yeah, they weren't
Yeah.
actually doing anything wrong. I mean, while we're talking about MLK, we might as well go to the next slide, and talk about like the two figures we're going to be talking about.
Mhm.
And the civil rights movement was so non-violent generally, like that was
Mhm.
what they were
That was
really,
the main thing.
and like a lot of the criticisms were that it wasn't active enough, it was too passive, it wasn't making enough of a difference, which to a certain degree was true, and I think that's why they started the Birmingham campaign and why they went to Birmingham, and we see so much trickle down effect from that
Mhm.
Birmingham campaign, because it was that was where like the actual strategies of the nonviolence campaign came from. They were practiced in Birmingham, and that's where we get the letters from Birmingham jail, like some of
Yeah.
Martin Luther King's most famous works. So do we want to start talking about Martin Luther King?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know he was inspired by Gandhi. I when I was researching
Yeah.
him, I was like, that's cool. Just because of his political views and his nonviolence views. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, definitely. Like, kind of with like our prior question and then our question right now, like, I thought it was crazy how even though people weren't reacting with violence or not as much violence, they were still pictured in the media as, oh, like, look at the destruction that they're causing, or look at the riots that are happening, when in reality, as we've mentioned, it's like, it's literally the oppressors that are literally doing this. So like the cops, the government, all these people that want to make them seem like they're in the wrong, when in reality they're just fighting for their equal rights as a human being. And it's insane to me how people would just make it twisted, make it so twisted within the media, and then people would just kind of follow along that same tradition throughout their family. But sorry, with Martin Luther King Jr., I thought it was great how he was able to give these thoughtful and really important, meaningful speeches to people who could relate, who understand the struggle. And it wasn't just to like African American people who were going through the same thing, but there were also, Caucasian supporters, different ethnicities and minority type of supporters who agreed with this point of view because it was unfair in the way they were being treated. So I believe like his famous speech, of course, like I Have a Dream, was incredibly powerful. Not to mention his efforts in passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act was insane, and thank God for his speech and for the amount of following that he had from people. I think it's amazing that he was able to get that many people, like not just on his side, but to see his point of view, to see what they were truly fighting for.
It's where you really see how eloquent and dynamic his speaking skills were, and
Yeah.
that really helped the movement as a whole. It's like he had friends like James Bevel, who we're also going to talk about, and he had support of a lot of people, but he also had a lot of doubt, and he was arrested like I think it was 29 times, like
Yeah.
was number 13, and so like he died in 1968. That's a lot of arrests in a short amount of time, and only because he was doing what he thought was right. And so historically we see him as like this upstanding person, and like even his failures, we see him putting in effort, we see him putting in organizing, stuff like that. I mean, I put one of his biggest failures just because it didn't work as the Chicago freedom movement, just because even today it's one of the most segregated cities in the United States. There's so much like wealth disparity, there's so much poverty, there's like segregated neighborhoods still in Chicago. And so when you look at the Chicago campaign and how it relates to the Birmingham campaign, you see that effort, and you see how he was trying to bring people together peacefully, But in one hand, in Birmingham, it spawned JFK's support. Johnson was a fervent supporter. It sparked the Civil Rights Act, Voting Act, stuff like that. And then in Chicago, it kind of just like, the effort was kind of like trickled down by Martin Luther King's supporters, not himself. So it kind of speaks to the differences within the African American communities, and like not everyone has the same mindset just because they have the same skin color. So it really speaks to that different dynamic. I didn't mean to cut anyone off. I'm sorry.
He advocated for peaceful approaches for society's like big issues in society. So like he used nonviolent methods to get their voices heard, to get the message across instead of using violence, because using violence with violence wasn't going to solve anything. With their protests, with their sit-ins, everything he stood by, even going to jail for, had a bigger impact than any of the other like the opposing side being violent. It just ended up making a bigger outcry. Like for example, like the Sunday was when they were marching from, I believe, Selma to Birmingham, and then like the police started rioting, it was a huge mess, and then the media got it on video, and it spurred a nationwide outcry, and it got more people sympathizing with the whole civil rights movement, seeing like, oh, like they're over here being peaceful, like trying to like do something for the rights, and then you have like the people who are supposed to protect them doing the opposite.
Yeah,
it's just like
definitely. And it also turned the heads of a lot of young white Americans. It was perpetuated by older generations, just like so many ideas are. And then where we look at the youth, we see a lot of change. So we see young white Americans sitting next to young Black Americans in sit-ins. We see young white American, not as many as the Black Americans, but we see the younger generations kind of saying, hey, something's wrong here. And it was the same people who, during the Vietnam protests, were like, something's wrong here. So even if they weren't cognizant of the exact problem because it had been perpetuated so long, especially in their family structures, we definitely see a lot of people being brought together by the violence against nonviolent protesters, like you said, Juliana, and by like speeches, like you said, Stephanie. So I definitely agree with you guys when you say that.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna add like something real quick. Like in addition to that, as you've mentioned, Sid, like it's just much of like a progressive mind in a young adult or a young teen could really make a difference within our own community and society. We've seen it back then. We're seeing it today with like the Black Lives Matter movement, along with like protecting like Latinos, like street vendors who are being attacked or who are being, like sadly they're being beaten up, or who are sadly just being targeted because of our color as well. So it's crazy how something that was so long ago, right, like 1950s, 1960s, and how teens back then were standing up for what they believed in, how we're doing that same thing right now or during these past couple of years. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I really like how you guys mentioned the youth and the role they played in. And this linked back to our book too. In Bombingham, we have Walter, Josie, and Lamar. These were kids and they took part in these nonviolent protests and stuff. So I thought it was really cool. You guys mentioned that.
I like that you brought in the book. I was struggling with how to bring it because I was like, it doesn't besides the fact that they both take place in Birmingham, and you definitely see the similarities. You see the events line up in the efforts of the protesters and the activists, and then the events which young Lamar saw, like Lamar's mom and dad were like, they were with it. They were like, we're standing, this is wrong, we're gonna go protest, stuff like that. So I like that you drew that in. Do we want to talk about James Bevel?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I know that he was. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, you're good. You can go.
I know that he had a lot of the same background as King. He went to seminary. While he was seminary, he organized sit-ins. He actually made changes while he was in seminary, and then he joined King, and he was like, "Hey, this is what I believe in as well." But when I was doing research, I found that there were documents that showed that Bevel was far more doubtful of the nonviolent strategies that King was confident in. So he had a lot of doubt as to whether or not they would actually be productive or successful. And he voiced them, which surprised me because of how close of an alliance he and King seemed to have. I'm glad for it. I'm glad he chose to have his own voice. But it was just interesting to me how he was like far more like wary of the strategies that were taking place. But he stood by King. He was with him in Birmingham. He was with him for Selma, for Montgomery marches. He was with him when he was assassinated. So I thought that was interesting. I had a hard time finding his failures. But I do know that he was very adamant in his like religion. He was very adamant in the civil rights movement. So I admired that part.
Yeah. To add on to that, aside from like organizing boycotts, like through segregated buses, he also created alongside like with King, like the freedom rides on bus lines, like in 1961 in the South. So I thought that was pretty amazing how he was contributing to that as well. Not to mention he was also making his voice heard. Like it wasn't all King by himself having to push this movement along. He had this help from Bevel as well.
Exactly. And more people than just Bevel. I think that was important. Yeah. I think we chose Bevel because he was in the book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like he was persistently by King's side. Like that was impressive to me.
Yeah.
Also, from researching him, I found out that he was huge on the anti-Vietnam War, and eventually became one of the main leaders for all the protests that took place, rallying against the Vietnam War, which I didn't know about that, and I found it like really interesting.
Yeah, so his politics and his civil rights activism didn't stop at African American rights. Mm-hmm. Definitely not. I think even in my research, he stood for like religious freedoms as well. Like he was very much right versus wrong, anti-segregation, anti-discrimination. So that was admirable.
Yeah.
All right.
To add on,
yes, no, go ahead.
To add on to what you guys are saying, I think as Sid, I think you mentioned, and a lot of you guys, he was with MLK, right? He was actually one of the leaders of the major organizations like SNCC, SCLC, and as a result, he was like an advisor almost. I think relating to Birmingham, it was Bevel's recommendations that the youth be like mobilized or like trained in Birmingham to help participate in peaceful anti-segregation protests. And that's where he comes in the Bombingham book as well, and how he, became involved with our main characters.
Exactly. He also advocated for the Children's Crusade.
Definitely.
While he was
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which it is so brutal, the methods that went about to dissolving those protests. Like there were kids,
Yeah.
like they were young adults, and beaten, bludgeoned, hosed down, humiliated, basically. But like that was the only way it seemed like white America even saw them, which is so unjust.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was
It's
part of the plan for King or Bevel, but that was the outcome in
Yeah.
what we've read historically. So, yeah. All right. So, these two fellas, these two gentlemen, they were seemingly historically great people. And so, in researching the Civil Rights Act, I know I found that JFK was kind of lenient with it. He kind of like pushed the civil rights movement to the side. He didn't make it an active part of his legislation. But when Birmingham came around and the Birmingham campaign and the violence that ensued there, he made a statement like to the public because it was part of the media. I think Stephanie, you said like it was so sensationalized, and so he had to make a statement. But he was shortly thereafter assassinated, right? And Johnson, who took over for him and was subsequently elected in a landslide, like made these acts a reality. Like he made it an active part of his legislation to get these acts through Congress. And so without Birmingham, without Selma, these acts wouldn't have been made possible. But with those two and with active legislation, active effort on high government pedestals, I think that's what made these acts actually happen. There's a great picture of Johnson shaking King's hand during the Voting Rights Act while the Voting Rights Act was being like signed and like going through the processes. So what do you guys have to say about this? I found a lot of interesting things, but
Honestly, I thought it was interesting how, well, not only interesting, but I thought it was great how African Americans were able to gain that momentum, like in political power, and were finally had their voices heard, which they rightfully deserved. Like after so many protests, sit-ins, the voter registration drives that they had, boycotting, after all of their efforts, their voices were finally being heard through this, like legislative victories. And so I thought that was great.
Like you said, how Kennedy proposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but then Johnson was the one that actually like made them a reality. And then Johnson was also the one that proposed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, um, which also was an act that enforced the 15th Amendment to the Constitution because of the violation of the Constitution for Americans, because it was going against their freedom of speech, all that.
exactly. I think it was integral that all of the players were involved. And
Yeah.
Vince, did you have anything to say about it?
I just want to sort of answer to the question. I think it was like, how did the civil rights movement kind of change after these victories?
Yeah.
And I sort of found that there was this shift from nonviolence to more violent means. I think people wanted, even with these victories, right? There were still areas in the country like they were slow in desegregating, and violence still occurred that prevented people from voting. And because of this, the civil rights activists, new generations, they were more agitated and they wanted a quicker end to like the segregation, to the discrimination. And when I was researching, I found the Rise New group of under Malcolm X, and I was so sad we didn't talk about Malcolm X, but that's like a different topic. But yeah. I just want to answer that.
Oh,
Yeah, Malcolm X
Yeah.
is definitely on the same tier as people like King, and he definitely deserves that recognition. So I agree. I'm glad you brought him up.
yeah.
What were you gonna say, Stephanie?
Oh, I was just gonna say I not too long ago I watched like the Malcolm X film on Netflix with my mom, and I thought it was interesting how, he had, even though he and King wanted to have the same rights for African Americans, they both went about it very differently. Like King went about it, as you've said, like a bit more passively with nonviolent acts and such. And not to say Malcolm X was like full on violent about it, but he wasn't afraid to get like to make his voice heard, basically. So I
Yeah,
thought that was pretty interesting.
definitely. And here's after the passing of these two acts, we see a lot of criticism um, against King. We see like
Yeah.
either, well, you got what you wanted, why are you still fighting? Or nothing's changed in reality. Why don't your methods haven't worked, why don't you go violent? And so he was kind of criticized on both ends and by
Yeah.
uh, on a multiracial scale. So, um, sorry.
Okay.
I think that was interesting as well.
Yeah.
That things didn't change once these acts took place. They definitely made a difference, especially in the long run, but things weren't, it wasn't an immediate fix. So I like that we got to talk about that. Does anybody have anything to add?
I'm okay.
All right. Well, that has been Chattanooga, and we had prompt 6. So thank you for watching.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.